Counseling and Discipline, the ASB, or any boards or committees of the American Academy of Actuaries, or any other actuarial or employer organization. With that out of the way, we'll go through the agenda. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about who the American Academy of Actuaries and what is the special role of the Academy within the world of the actuarial organizations. Then we'll talk about what is professionalism. We'll talk about self-regulation, why that's important to us, and what we have to support that in the professionalism infrastructure. Then we'll talk about some Academy resources. And along the way, I'll pause at a few moments when we're having the Q&A session, so you can submit in the chat or through the Q&A button, and we'll be able to answer those questions along the way. So go ahead, as you have a question, go ahead and send that in, and we'll pick them up when I pause for some questions. Okay? So first, a little bit about the American Academy of Actuaries. It was founded in 1965. And I think just a little bit of history helps us understand how it fits in with the other organizations. And especially for you to understand how the Academy works with and for U.S. actuaries in the areas of professionalism and public policy. The Academy was founded in 1965, and at that time, the North American actuarial profession was technically strong. However, the profession really lacked public recognition. Some of you might feel like we still lack some public recognition. And more importantly, the profession lacked the trust of the public. This was a problem because of the increased attention at that time that public and private insurance and pension plans were getting. As a result, the leaders of the profession decided it was necessary to take steps to strengthen our profession. It's interesting, since the Academy was formed in 1965, to look at the very first yearbook that was published, and that was in 1967. And there we see what leaders were thinking about at that time. And you'll see that the Academy was formed because, and I quote, "The work of the actuary had assumed a position of considerable public importance, and it is essential that all people who hold themselves out to be actuaries are qualified to perform their duties in a fully competent manner and in the public interest." So that's a pretty high bar, a fully competent manner and performing them in the public interest. You'll also see some of the other things here about our key goal is maintaining and promoting actuarial professionalism and self-regulation, and we'll talk a lot more about that later. To represent qualified actuaries of all specialties, to serve as the National Association for U.S. Actuaries and the voice on public policy issues. And today we have a membership of more than 20,000 actuaries. This history shows us that the intent was for the actuary to act as a national association that establishes standards of practice in the U.S. and the association that speaks on behalf of the U.S. actuarial profession on public policy issues. And it also promotes professionalism and self-regulation, as we talked about. So we do this through the 20,000 members that we have, and here's really a good place for me to encourage you to, as you have the opportunity to become a volunteer for the Academy. There are many opportunities for doing so, whether it's helping out with writing a paper or something else, serving on the ABCD, and any number of areas that you can work in. So it's just a great opportunity to have that happen. One of the places where we used some of that was in the Hill visits, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we talk about advancing the professionalism and practice. So it kind of begins with the code of conduct, supported by our qualification standards, the Actuarial Standards Board, and the ABCD. Also, informing public policy. We serve the public and the profession through public policy efforts, creating issue briefs. And we recently had the Hill visits where 40 actuaries had more than 30 visits with congressional members or their staff. This is really important to help members of Congress and their staffs become aware of the profession and how we can help shape policy. And it was interesting that just a few weeks after that, one of the health practice actuaries was called as a follow-up to that for some help in crafting legislation around Medicaid and Medicare. So those kind of things, those connections to public policy really help us advance the profession. I want to talk now about the new membership requirements. You may have heard about this. They will become effective on January 1st, 2026, and it applies to all new members and anyone who is being reinstated. The board regularly reviews the requirements to become a member of the Academy through the Committee on Membership, and it became clear to us that we wanted to have a better baseline for all actuaries of exactly what everyone knew. The things that we could say, every member of the Academy knows these things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, there are two pieces of this. The first one is education and basic education. So people will be asked to attest to the fact that they have achieved the competencies in something called the competency framework. That lays out baseline knowledge of key actuarial competencies, knowledge of U.S. laws and practices, and U.S. actuarial professionalism. For people who have a U.S. designation such as the ASA, ACAS, or EA, the vast majority of the requirements of the competency framework will have been covered in the course of passing your exams. But the reason we have the competency framework out there is so that at the time you're applying for membership, you can say that you have actually had covered the material that's listed in the competency framework. You also need to have achieved an actuarial credential from an actuarial organization. Both the credential and the organization must be recognized by the Academy. And you'll note here that there are some links for you here, and this presentation will be posted to your club's website so that you'll be able to go in and use those links. There's also an experience requirement. 3 years of responsible actuarial experience, including at least 1 year of responsible U.S. actuarial experience, must be obtained. So many of you will have been members when there was a 3-year requirement. And I must say, when we first started talking about this, a lot of people did not remember that that requirement had been removed, but the membership committee suggested adding it back in. And I should note that if people have had internships, they may qualify toward that experience requirement. This simply goes back to the Academy's mission to support actuaries, but also to protect the public and make sure that actuaries have the tools to be able to practice in a competent and professional manner. Soon after the competency framework was complete, I was asked to chair the new, at that time, Education Committee. This group has been working for the last 3 years to flesh out the curriculum that will be needed to give actuaries the tools they need to satisfy any remaining competencies they need to develop. These were primarily related to U.S. specific topics such as laws and regulations, and also our U.S. social programs. We recognize that many actuaries over the course of gaining their 3 years of experience will have satisfied the competence related to their specific area of practice. So as an example, if you did not study through the actuarial exams to get your associateship, if you did not study, let's say, Social Security, there will be a way for you to go look up the laws related to that and learn about it. But you may also have, in the course of doing your work, have had to study that to know how it interacted, how Social Security interacts with your products and so on. So you may know enough about it to satisfy the competency framework. And so at this point, I just want to stop and ask if there happen to be any questions so far about these new requirements to become a member of the Academy. I know that most of you are probably already members of the Academy, but you may get questions from students that work with you, candidates that work with you, so that you'll need to be ready to answer those questions. So are there any questions coming in?
No questions yet, Nancy. And
Okay.
if folks have any questions, feel free to, you can send them in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and we can, Nancy can address those there.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go on then to professionalism. So we've talked a lot about professionalism already, but I want to say a little bit more about it. This slide, I think, really helps us look at who are those people that actuaries interact with. You can see there are four main areas that actuaries need to think about in satisfying their professional obligations. Remember that the mission of the American Academy of Actuaries is to serve the public and the U.S. actuarial profession. So you have responsibilities directly to the public, to regulators, to your employers or clients, and to the profession. As discussed in the formation of the Academy, it's important that we not only have the technical skills and abilities, but that we maintain the credibility of the profession and continue to earn the trust of all of these different areas. Putting the public first. It's important that each actuary embrace this, because if one actuary acts in an unprofessional manner, it reflects on the entire profession and potentially impacts the credibility and the trust that the public has in the profession. So our standards and disciplinary processes are necessary to assure the public that we can, as a profession, be trusted. They are why the Academy was created. They were and are necessary for U.S. actuaries to be recognized as a self-regulating profession. So what does it mean when we say putting the public first? And there's really four areas of this, and we'll talk about each of them a little bit more later. But just so you have the high level for this, actuaries may perform actuarial services only when qualified to do so. That's part of the code of conduct. Actuaries must follow applicable standards wherever they practice. So we talk about U.S. actuarial standards of practice, but if you happen to be practicing in another country or in a jurisdiction that has different standards of practice, you need to follow the local standards of practice. When the code and the law conflict, you need to follow the law. So we'll never ask you to do something that's illegal just because you're following the code of conduct and the standards of practice. And finally, actuaries who commit material violations are subject to counseling and discipline. And we'll talk a lot more about that later. The Academy supports a self-regulation actuarial profession that serves and protects the public, and a profession that has earned the regulatory and public recognition and continues to earn that recognition and trust. It really all starts with the code of conduct. And I would encourage any of you who are members of the Academy to order this little book. I just checked before we went on the air that it is still available to order. The only thing I don't like about it is that it is the same size, shape, and color as my US passport. And one of these days I'm going to be rushing to meet a plane and grab my code of professional conduct instead of my passport from my desk and try to convince the TSA that being an actuary makes me worthy of boarding their plane. I don't know how successful I'll be with that. But it all starts with this code. The Code of Professional Conduct sets forth what it means for an actuary to act as a professional. It identifies the responsibilities that actuaries have to the public, to their clients and employers, and to the actuarial profession. In addition to representing the actuarial profession on public policy issues, the Academy is responsible for making sure the qualification, practice, and professionalism standards are in place for actuaries credentialed by one or more of the 5 US-based actuarial organizations in the US. So if we look at this infographic, it builds out from the Code of Conduct. So the Code of Conduct is in the center. The US qualification standards are there, the Actuarial Standards Board, so the Actuarial Standards of Practice, and the Actuarial Board for Counseling and Discipline, the ABCD, is also there. So I talked about self-regulation, and you might think, well, it seems like we already have a lot of regulations, and we do. So why do we talk about self-regulation? When we use this term, we're really referring to the profession itself, regulating the standards and expectations of behavior through the structure created within the Academy. The Academy was created to do this and continues to fill this need that was recognized way back in 1965. But why do we want to be self-regulated? Well, a long time ago, Walt Rugland, one of those people who was instrumental in getting the actuarial profession recognized more, said, "It is our challenge to write standards we can live with before someone else writes standards we cannot." And what has happened in countries where actuaries have lost their ability to regulate themselves, you end up with a government bureaucrat, regulator, writing the standards that you need to use to satisfy their particular area of interest. So really 5 reasons why we want to stay self-regulated. First, we think it's an efficient and effective way to govern the profession. We can talk actuary to actuary and get things done that way. It prevents the development of, it permits the development of principles-based standards. It recognized the value and the need for actuarial judgment. So if you think about regulations, they rarely have something that says, use your judgment here. It says, do this, do this, do this. Of course, we need to keep those within the boundaries and be compliant with applicable laws and regulations, but it does give a little bit of actuarial judgment. It also supports the evolution of actuarial practice. We don't have to go back and redo a very complicated regulation when something new is going on in the actuarial world. And finally, it prevents enactment of rules that are not actuarially sound. You've probably seen some things like that. You may have seen regulations that you feel like are not particularly actuarially sound. It goes back to the thing that I said earlier, though, that if the law says you need to do something or a regulation says you need to do that, you still need to do that, but you may want to point out why it doesn't make sense in every situation. So in order to stay self-regulated, there's some responsibilities that every actuary has, and there are also responsibilities that people who supervise actuaries have. So I want to talk first about the responsibilities of every actuary. First, exemplify professionalism. Talk about how you satisfy the standards of practice for a specific project. You can build your professional reputation by volunteering at the Academy, as I talked about before. You can contribute to the policy discussions and build your network. We need people with hands-on experience in order to make sure we're reflecting current practice. So as I said before, becoming a volunteer really is a great opportunity for you. The second thing is to mentor and support other actuaries. Help them understand not just the technical issues, but how to navigate the politics within your department, how to communicate with other areas, and so on to help build the reputation of the actuaries. And finally, every actuary has the responsibility to report violations of the Code of Conduct to the ABCD. Now, actuaries who supervise other actuaries have some special additional requirements. The first one is to create a culture of professionalism. The leader of a team, the leader of an entire department has a chance to really impact their culture. So some things you could do there again is talk about the ASOPs at a unit or a team meeting or a whole department meeting. Make sure that those who report to you see you as a professional. I mentioned earlier the book, the Code of Conduct book, and I actually would always keep it out on the corner of my desk. I'll talk later about an instance where someone picked it up and read it to me because they thought I was violating the Code of Conduct. So that's how that goes. But you need to create a culture of safety within your department, a way for people to disagree with each other respectfully, and make sure you have people in your area who will come and tell you the truth. Um, a lot of times people who report to you are going to tell you what they think you want to hear and so on, but you need to know who the truth tellers are in your department. You can go to them and say, hey, what's really behind this particular paper or whatever. I have to say that our actuarial department at State Farm had a culture of arguing, sometimes pretty heatedly over the correct course of action, so much so that other departments asked us what we did to create that kind of a culture. And I would have to tell them that we really made it possible for people to say what they thought within the actuarial department. Um, to argue about things that helped us make sure we got to the right place when people were arguing about what if this happened, what if that happened. I think if someone raised this issue, then that course of action would get us in trouble and things like that. So it was really our way of arguing out where our final position should be. The only thing that I needed to warn the actuaries about was that that was all fine within the confines of our department. But when we left the department, we needed to be a little bit more respectful and less argumentative in our tone. So while people respected the fact that we had that in our department, I think sometimes they managed to ruffle some feathers by arguing with, for instance, my boss when we were outside of the actuarial department, and sometimes it wasn't particularly appreciated. I talked earlier about the experience at the ABCD and the importance of the request for guidance function. I'll talk more about that later as well. But I once had a junior actuary call in and ask for a request for guidance from the ABCD. And when I called him back and we had a conversation about what was happening, what he was being asked to do, I told him, I think this probably doesn't rise to the level of a material violation of the Code of Conduct. But you can still file a complaint if you want. Of course, if you're filing a code of conduct complaint against your boss, you might want to update your resume first. I did tell him that, but also just needed to think about whether it really rose to that level. And at the end, people can file a complaint if they want at the end of the request for guidance process. But the real reason for that process is just help people walk through what they're hearing and thinking about. And again, I'll talk about that more later. But this actuary called me back a couple of weeks later and said that he understood what I had said, that it probably wouldn't rise to the level of a material violation of the Code of Conduct. But he was resigning from his position because he did not want to work for a company that was asking him to walk that close to the line between right and wrong. And I actually thought that was a great success, that even though he wasn't in a position to file a complaint against his boss, he was able to think about and talk about that with them and say, I just don't want to work in this area that's puts me into a gray area a lot. So I thought that was a great example of having that kind of culture. It's the reason why you want to have that kind of culture where people are willing to speak up and talk about things like that. I think it's also important to create a culture where if you have a rotation program especially, or you're moving people between different actuarial roles, it's also important for you to take this seriously and give them time as they're entering their new role. A lot of times you're trying to finish up your old role and step into your new role, but you need time to develop the competencies that you need in a new area. So just be aware of that as you are supervising other actuaries and helping them with that. Next, actually, I want to stop there and see if anyone had any questions about that part of the presentation so far.
I'm not seeing any questions right now, Nancy.
Okay. I didn't know I had made this presentation so clear and self-explanatory.
That's right.
Okay, so we'll go on and talk about US qualification standards. Think back to that triangle that I showed you before with the code of conduct in the middle and the qualification standards out to the side. On one side of the triangle, we're going to talk, first of all, that the US qualification standards are rooted in precept 2 of the code, where it says, an actuary shall perform actuarial services only when the actuary is qualified to do so on the basis of basic and continuing education and experience, and only when the actuary satisfies applicable qualification standards. It goes on then in one of the annotations of precept 2 to say, it is the professional responsibility of an actuary to observe applicable qualification standards that have been promulgated by a recognized actuarial organization for the jurisdictions in which the actuary renders actuarial services, and to keep current regarding changes in these standards. So that kind of goes back to the point that I made earlier, that you may not always be working in the US. You may be working somewhere else where they have a different actuarial organization who is providing guidance on these things. So you need to be aware of what the standards are in the jurisdiction where you are working. We did have a new US qualification standard come out effective January 1st, 2022. So that was effective for statements of actuarial opinion that were made starting on January 1st, 2023. So if you think about how that works, you always are kind of a year behind. So in 1 year, you are satisfying all of the requirements to be qualified for the next year when you actually do submit a statement of actuarial opinion. So just to think about the structure of the US qualification standards, there's an introduction where all of the definitions are included. Then there's the general qualification standard, which talks about the basic education you need and the experience requirements, and also your continuing education requirement. So these are different from the qualifications that you need to become a member of the academy. These are things that you need to do for the rest of your career when you're deciding whether you're qualified to do something. If someone is signing a statement that requires a specific qualification standard, for instance, if you're the actuary who's signing off on your company's reserves, there are additional requirements called the specific qualification standard. Then there's also a section on what if you're changing practice areas, or what if you're doing a different kind of application. You'll learn about that. It also shows your acknowledgement of your qualifications, so it gives you some suggested language for that. I have to say that the consultants are really good about this, that when they come in to do a job, they will say, here's why I'm qualified to perform this kind of actuarial opinion and so on. In companies, I think we're a little bit more lax about that, but I think it's a really good idea to include in when you're making a recommendation or when you're presenting results, to note how and why you're qualified to be giving this statement of actuarial opinion. And finally, it gives an opportunity to do some record keeping. This especially applies to your continuing education. When I was on the ABCD, one of the things we would usually do at the beginning of when a new complaint had been filed was to ask the person against whom the complaint had been filed to provide their records of their continuing education. And remember, this could be back 2 or 3 or 4 years when they were doing the work for which a complaint was filed. So we often found that what looked like something just thrown together at the last minute, maybe I read the Wall Street Journal and got some information about economics and things like that. So the USQS actually has a sample form. You don't have to use that form. You can do it in whatever way you want to, but I think using that form just makes it a little easier for you to keep track of all of the different things that you need. So it makes sure that you have the bias requirement, make sure that you have the professionalism requirement and so on. It just helps you with that. So you can use a spreadsheet or whatever you want, but make sure that you're documenting the things that you went to and what you learned in the process of doing that. So the US qualification also defines a statement of actuarial opinion. I've used that SAO, statement of actuarial opinion, many times already. And I just wanted to give you the definition of what that means, because people have a lot of conversations about this of, was that actually a statement of actuarial opinion, or was it just a response to a question? And so here are the two components of that. First, it's an opinion expressed by an actuary in the course of performing actuarial services. The second piece is, and it's an opinion intended by the actuary to be relied upon by the person or organization to which it is addressed. So if you send something to your boss, it says, and you intend for that your boss to use that in creating some other thing, they're going to use it and rely on that. You need to explain how you had the qualifications to do that. And again, I feel like companies more than consulting firms are a little bit lax on this piece. So the US qualifications standards web page is a good place to go. First of all, if you want to read the entire USQS, that's a good place to go. They also have a place for FAQs. Questions that have already been asked and get asked over and over again, they'll put out here with the official response of the qualifications group. And they also have a place for you to submit a question. If the thing that you're wondering about is not in the FAQs, you also have the opportunity to ask a question. Now, you also can do this through the request for guidance process. You can call into the ABCD, talk to one of the members of the ABCD and get a little bit more information about that. So now if we go over to the other side of the triangle, we're going to talk about the actuarial standards of practice and what the Actuarial Standards Board does. So again, this is grounded in the Code of Professional Conduct, where Precept 3 says an actuary shall ensure that actuarial services performed by or under the direction of the actuary satisfy applicable standards of practice. And then we have the purpose of the Actuarial Standards Board. Sets the standards for appropriate actuarial practice in the US through the development and promulgation of actuarial standards of practice. So that's a lot of words, but once again, just grounded, going back to the Code of Conduct. When we look at the ASOPs, why do we have them? Really two reasons. One is it's your guide to practicing in the US. It's not that you have to follow them, but this is sort of it. it codifies the normal way of doing business, the things that you must do, the things that you might do, and just helps you know how other actuaries would approach the same kind of work. It also documents then current practice. So if an ASOP changes and you later have someone question your work from several years ago, they need to go back and use the standard of practice that was in effect at the time you did that work. Sometimes people try to judge your work based on the current standard of practice as opposed to what it was at the time you did that. So it gives you a great way to document the what we call the then current practice if there is a later dispute. And this is what I kind of call the ASOP advantage, why we should be happy as actuaries that we have these actuarial standards of practice. First of all, it provides practicing actuaries with a basis for assuring that their work will conform to appropriate practices. Again, you don't have to follow them, and we'll talk more about that later, but it gives you kind of what a reasonable actuary in your position doing this kind of work would be doing. It also provides guidance, particularly in practice areas that may be somewhat unfamiliar. It gives strong evidence to an interested observer that the profession serves the public in an effective and responsible way. And it offers evidence of appropriate professional practice in the event of a professional disciplinary action or a civil action. So just a few things to think about. It helps you compare your work to the standards at the time. The other thing I wanted to say about the ASOPs was on the ASB website, they have a lot of information about the standards of practice that are in progress. So they keep up with that in a publication called the Box Score. It's also a place where you can go to see the comments that are being made on a standard of practice that is underway. So when the Actuarial Standards Board comes up with a new standard of practice, they will write a draft version of it and put that out for comment to the public. And this is where I really encourage you to go out and read those comments. If it's an area that you're working in, read those comments, see how they address them, and perhaps even make your own comment just in case. Now, I mentioned that you don't have to follow the standards of practice, and that's true. There is an exception for that, but you must state that exception at the time that you're doing the work. So you can't wait for 2 years later when someone's questioning your work and say, well, no, I didn't follow the standard of practice, but I did it my own way. I did it a better way. That doesn't fly. You have to say that as you're doing the work, say, I recognize the standard of practice says this, but I don't think it applies to my work because whatever. And just note that at the time and say what you did instead. So that really helps you document that you read the existing standard of practice. You saw something unique in the work that you were doing and decided not to follow the standard of practice exactly, but you did something different and you document why that was true. So a couple of ASOPs that have recently taken effect. In December, we had the new ASOP 24 on life insurance illustrations, model regulation. One thing I want to note here is that usually the ASOPs will only address if they're dealing with an issue that is a model regulation or NAIC regulation. They usually will only address the model regulation. They don't try to cover all of the state exceptions to that. There are some cases where they will, but often they will not. So you might have to make an exception. Again, note that, the New York law says something different, and here's why I did it this way. Also on January 1st of this year, ASOP 27, selection of economic assumptions for measuring pension obligations. And on May 1st, just fresh off the press, there's a new enterprise risk management ASOP number 58. And it's going to replace ASOP's 46 and 47, both of which address enterprise risk management. Those will both be obsolete now, and you'll have to use the new ASOP 58. Then we have one ASOP that's open for comment right now, just to keep you all current. It has to do with property casualty cash flows. I mentioned before that the ASB will consider all of the comments that are submitted and respond to each of them as they come in. And so this is a chance for you to participate in that process. If this is your area of work, that you might want to get together with a few people at your company or individually submit it as a comment to see what the reaction would be as this is being developed. So this is a really important way that actuaries can participate in the process of developing new standards. I'm going to stop there to see if there are any questions that have come in yet. Otherwise, we'll go on to the ABCD conversation.
Nancy, we have one question.
Okay.
Are there any efforts to standardize actuarial qualification standards globally?
I think there's a lot of conversation about that at different places. For instance, with the International Actuarial Association, which the U.S. Organizations participate in. But I think it is really difficult to do that. And just seeing how difficult it is within the U.S. to have those qualifications standardized. I do know that some of the countries that don't have very well-developed standards yet would rely on either the US standards or the UK standards, but I'm not aware of any effort right now to be trying to standardize that across the world. If anyone else knows, please please submit that as an answer to that question. So then we'll go on to talk about the ABCD. I mentioned earlier that I served on that for 6 years, and I thought it was a great experience. Of course, it's hard to go through the situations where an actuary is actually being disciplined. People, if you can imagine, if someone's having a public discipline, they really are ruining their career at this point, especially if they're expelled from one of the organizations. They lose that credential, they lose their ability to speak as an actuary. So that was kind of hard, but on the other hand, it was so good to see people actually seeing situations that they are uncomfortable with and coming in to report those to us. So I talked a lot about RFGs already, and we really hadn't talked about how that process works, but let me just give you a little bit about it. It is the main way that the ABCD works with actuaries today. We'll talk later about the number of those that we get in. But as I said, when you have something that bothers you, you can send in a request to the ABCD. They will have someone who participates in your same area of practice call you back, discuss your situations, and talk about that. And then you can decide what your next steps are. Other functions of ABCD are to consider complaints about possible violations of the code of conduct. I think that's what we usually think about them doing. And then to recommend discipline to the membership organizations. Now, it's important to recognize this because people think that the ABCD actually sends out the punishment or the discipline, but we really don't. The ABCD recommends to whichever organization. So if you happen to belong to the CAS and the Academy, the ABCD would recommend a level of discipline, whether it's a public reprimand or expulsion from the profession. And then the Academy and the CAS would both look at that and convene their own discipline committees and decide what happens. So just remember that the ABCD just recommends discipline. And cases have happened where two organizations give slightly different levels of discipline. These requests for guidance, I was saying it's the most frequent interaction we have with the public, getting close to 100 a year. These again are situations where people are just uncomfortable with something. They want to know things like, am I qualified to do this? How will I know? It's a completely confidential process. No one will know except you and you who call in, the member of the ABCD, and then they do share the question and their answer with the rest of the ABCD in order to two purposes really. One is to make sure that if someone else gets the same question, we have a consistent answer, but also someone else on the board might have a slight twist on that they would ask the person who was originally contacted to go back to the person who had the request and add in a little bit more detail on that. If we look at practice areas, these tend to jump around a little bit depending on a lot of things. One is if something new is happening in a practice area, it sometimes generates a few more complaints. One that stands out to me on this slide is in 2021, the number of casualty complaints that came in. And then if you look at the lower half of that chart, also were resolved in 2021. So this had to do with a disagreement among actuaries, which was primarily, I would say, a governance sort of issue. It's ongoing. I can't really say much more about that, but a lot of requests came in at that time. Other things that have happened is someone really kind of goes out and starts reading, as an example, pension reports that are filed and starts filing some complaints about those. It just kind of depends on what's going on. So I don't think you should take anything away from the practice areas, like one practice area is less professional than the others. If we look at major issues by precept, it is really hard. You have to try to do this to violate any of the other precepts without violating precept 1, because it says act with integrity, perform services with competence, things like that, protect the reputation of the profession. So the other things that came up during 2024 were performing work when not qualified, failing to satisfy an ASOP, or inadequate actuarial communication. So those are just some of the things that come up regularly, and those were the ones that were solved in 2024. You can go to the Academy's Public Discipline webpage, and that's where you'll see all the people who have had a public discipline since inception. So 1992, the ABCD started, and the Academy was taking their recommendations. You can see over those 40 years, 13 people were expelled, 11 were suspended. That can be a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year suspension. And 15 people got a public reprimand. That means it's out in the public, it's out on all the actuarial sites, so that people know that this particular actuary has been reprimanded. And the public discipline notices have been getting a little bit more detailed, because we felt like this was a way to educate actuaries more. So if you're out there reading a discipline notice and someone it just says the person violated precept 3, and so therefore we got this discipline imposed. But to have a little bit more about that, if you go look at those public discipline notices, there's everything from criminal behavior, so committing fraud, to smaller things like not cooperating with the ABCD. My favorite precept in the Code of Conduct is 14, and that is that you have to cooperate with the ABCD. I want to talk about Academy resources, but they're all available out on the website, and I know we're getting short on time, so I want to take a chance. I see we do have a couple questions coming in on the chat. Alex, do you want to ask those questions if you think that'd be good?
Sure thing. We've got one in the chat, and then we've got another one in the Q&A. I think
Okay.
this chat one came in first. So Leonard's asking, is there any attempt by the Academy to work with the SOA to push back on removing content from exams? I know regulators are not pleased with FSAs not being able to sign SAOs without additional backfilling.
Yeah, that's a very timely question because it's all part of when I mentioned in the development of the competency framework. We worked really closely, especially with the SOA and CAS, because they were removing so much US content. And I have to say that when I'm facilitating at the Associate's Professionalism courses, I hear a lot about this from our international students who are saying, I don't know why I have to study so much US content. So I would say that we do have that conversation with the SOA in particular, but their stance is they are becoming a more and more international organization, and because of that, they feel like they need to limit the amount of US content that is in the associateship, especially syllabus. So that's where, back to the conversation about the competency framework, that's where the Academy will develop some programs to cover that. And like particularly the one you raised about the signing actuarial statements of opinion, signing off on the reserves. That's why we have the, no, I'm not going to get the right name for it, the seminar that allows you to become the life health qualification seminar. That's it. So that you can leave that 2-day session and be able to sign the statements of actuarial opinion. So that's we're not really pushing back on the SOA. We're asking, what have you taken off that we should put into the life health qualification seminar? Is there another one, Alex?
Yes, we've got one more. So this may be two questions, but are there actuarial standards for use of AI or for development of actuarial software?
Um, great question. And it's interesting there. Let me actually forward to this. Well, no, I'm going to stop here. So we show the discussion papers here. So that's one of the resources that's out there on the Academy website. And one way to develop some of these, where it's really a brand new area of practice before we do anything about that or write a standard for it, to have a discussion paper. So there's a discussion paper out there on the professionalism implications of generative AI. And so that's where it would probably start, that as we first start hearing about this, develop a discussion paper to help with that. Start to ask the question, do we need a standard to address this? Because we're starting to hear more and more about that. But for the most part, we would say for this, generative AI and a lot of the other new things are covered in the standard of practice on modeling. Really, generative AI is just another model. And so there are things in that discussion paper that you need to know about whenever you're using a model. It's just being applied to a brand new concept that people aren't very familiar with. I hope that helps. I'm sure that soon there will be standards of practice being developed around some of those new ideas that are out there. Anything else? Any other questions?
That covers the questions, Nancy, that I
Okay.
see.
Well, I just want to encourage people to use the badge that you have that you can use in your digital signature, and just want to kind of summarize things that we learned today. So self-regulation, we think, is an efficient, effective way to govern the actuarial profession. The professionalism framework that we have is really key to maintaining the public trust. Really encourage people to take time to consider professionalism in advance, rather than needing to justify it going backwards. If you see that precise guidance is not available for your assignment going exactly to the question about generative AI, rely on first principles. So if that was just a regular model, what are the standards of practice regarding modeling? And then there are lots of resources available in the professionalism toolbox. This is where I would encourage you to go if you're wanting to do a unit meeting and help everyone get some more continuing education. If you're wanting to have your pricing, life insurance pricing people review the new illustration regulation, things like that. It's a great way for you to get to those webinars, and they are all free to Academy members. The recorded versions, not the live versions, but the recorded versions are free for Academy members. So with that, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to come here. I hope we've addressed most of the questions that have come in, and feel free to go to actuary.org and look around there and see what is of interest to you, what is relevant to your area of practice, and most importantly, just keep professionalism top of mind as you're doing your work every day. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you have a good remaining parts of your meeting.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us today. Thank you. Okay, we will start our second session in a few minutes, exactly at noon. Our second speaker of the day is Paul Hentz. Paul is the Chief Actuary and Chief Risk Officer for Prosperity. He joined in May 2024 and has more than 19 years of actuarial risk management and insurance industry experience. Before joining Prosperity, Paul was most recently the CFO for Pacific Life's institutional division and previously led the PRT and stable value businesses. Prior to that, he was chief actuary for Equitable and held various senior actuarial and risk roles at Prudential and Transamerica, including leading PRT pricing at Prudential and serving as chief actuary for shared services at Transamerica. Let's turn it over to Paul to get us started.
Thanks, Phyllis, for the introduction. Excited to talk with everyone today. So first, let me share my screen. In terms of my background, I actually did just pass my 20-year anniversary this weekend, which my kids made sure to tell me how old I am after doing that. But so that was exciting. Let's see here.
Well, congrats.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I was very proud of that accomplishment. So I've been excited about that. In terms of my background overall, so this topic I want to cover both the leadership communication with senior management and then also leading large teams. I think about this as this is pretty much entirely things I've learned along the way, because these are not things that came to me naturally. I was very intentional in my career journey of, as I moved into new roles, focusing on that as a new role and figuring out what I needed to learn and develop and grow at in that role to be effective. And certainly leading teams and communicating with senior management are both things that I was not at all skilled at or trained at. I was, like all of you, I'm sure, very good at math, but I was a high introvert and I hated to do presentations. The college course with the least amount of writing and the least amount of presenting was the course I chose. So I took math as electives as an example, but I knew that as I moved into more senior roles, I had to learn how to not only get the right answer, but figure out how to have my team execute on that, buy into that, and also how to get senior management to buy into that. So in terms of my journey overall, as Phyllis mentioned, I'm currently at Prosperity Life Group. We have our largest office location is in Austin, Texas. In terms of, and we're a large fixed annuity writer with about 25 billion of assets under management and growing quickly, about 10x over the last 5 years. So my journey, I've had over 15 years of VP or higher roles, 15 different roles across all the various actuarial functions, a couple of chief actuary roles, a P&L leadership role, a divisional CFO role. And 9 of those have had roles of 50 or more people on the team. So I've learned a lot of things not to do, and also learned some things that have worked well, at least for me. So hopefully all of you can take maybe something away from this as things that will be useful tips for you to consider in your own leadership journey. So in terms of leading large teams, so the first thing that I focus on in terms of leading large teams is starting with trust. So I have at this point a pretty well refined methodology for my first 90 days leading a large organization. And I believe that my strategy is first build relationships with key stakeholders and with the team, focusing on gathering feedback from the stakeholders and feedback from the team on what's working well, and where are there opportunities for improvement, and what are suggestions from the team. So I take a strong view that, and then after I collect that feedback, I then develop collaboratively a roadmap, a strategy with my leadership team, and then broadly look to gain buy-in from my stakeholders and my broader team on that overall roadmap. I'm a big believer that 20% is developing the strategy, but 80% of it is execution. And it's really critical to have the buy-in, especially from the team, on the roadmap in terms of executing. And to get their buy-in, it's very critical that they're co-creators of that roadmap and feel like their input has gone into that roadmap. And that also ultimately makes the strategy a much better strategy. So typically when I'm in a new leadership role, it'll feel to my stakeholders actually like I'm going fairly slow for the first couple months, but then they'll see the team be much more effective over the next 9, 12, 18, 24 months after that, because there's that collective buy-in. And I learned that from making a mistake of not doing that and seeing that it was much more difficult versus following that strategy. The next tip I would cover would be facilitative leadership. And so this is, as actuaries, I think we go through the exams and there is a right answer, right? Is it A, B, C, or D? It's one of those four, and there is a very clear right answer. But what I found as I have worked with larger teams, worked with different stakeholders, worked with different functions, is that there usually is a good answer that you can get everyone to agree to, or there's the perfect answer that you can never get agreement and never gets executed on. So the good answer that moves the organization forward, and that the organization executes on is the value. It's the more valuable than spinning your wheels and on trying to get to perfection. In terms of facilitative leadership, I'm a big advocate that I want to help the leaders on my team and the entire team. I want to help them as much as necessary, but not more than necessary. It's very easy to be overly directive and try to jump to the conclusion that this is what we should do. And what I found is more effective is that if someone's working on it 100% of their time, and I'm only working on it 1% of the time, they're going to have a really good answer, and oftentimes a better answer. And the key in my role is to help give them the broader context in terms of what the overall objectives of the organization are, what is senior management or the board thinking, and giving them that context allows them to develop the right optimal answer, versus trying to micromanage exactly what the answer is. And the philosophy I generally take is that if I perceive someone as 80% correct, I let them do it and move on, rather than trying to get to perfection. Because if I try to get to perfection, then I'll demoralize people. They'll be less engaged and they'll feel less ownership. And ultimately, oftentimes, they'll have been perfectly fine and perfectly correct with their proposal, because there was some facts or information I didn't know, because I only spent 1% of the time versus their 100%. But that's really difficult to let go of, because at the more junior level, and as you're going through exams, you want to get to that perfect right answer. But I found it's better to let my team, as long as they're mostly correct from my perception, let them go forward, and then save for when there's something really an issue that's clearly an issue, or where we need 100% perfection, or it's extremely important. Focus in on those issues and not all the other issues. And by doing that, you have more engaged team members, and you have the capacity to really hone in and focus on the really important value, creative, critical issues, because you're not spreading yourself too thin as a leader. And that's something that took me a lot of time to develop. And what I realized as I started to have teams, is that it's not about my productivity as an individual anymore. It's about the productivity of my broader team. So if I can make the team 10% more productive, and it's a team of 50 or 100 or 200, that's really, really valuable in terms of the FD equivalent, versus trying to individually be more productive than the average person. Is not, it's not how you're successful, in my experience, at a more senior level. And then in terms of after successfully executing on a roadmap, on the overall strategy for the organization, getting more clarity on who's doing what, making sure that resources are well allocated. I believe it's important to, what I would call, lead and then let go. I think it's very important to, one, delegate as much as you can, which is difficult. So I'm a big believer that I want to stretch the folks on my team as much as possible, but not stretch them so far that I overwhelm them. So that's a very sweet spot in there of trying to stretch but not overwhelm. I believe with that it's important to continue to delegate and keep delegating. And that then as a leader frees up more of your time to take on more initiatives or ultimately to work yourself out of a job, frankly, and then move into something new in the organization to be even more impactful. What I find frustrating at a more junior level is to have a manager that wants to hold on to things. I think it's very important to not overwhelm your team, but to keep stretching them and keep giving them higher and higher level opportunities and things to do, because that helps their development and it helps their growth. So with that, I think it's important to set up the team to be able to thrive without you, to continue to grow. It's also important to coach your team. And I think about it as trying to be, rather than feed forward. So trying to coach in advance. So when there's a critical meeting, there's some critical stakeholders that someone on my team will be meeting for the first time, coaching them in advance on what to prepare for, what's critical, how to interact with the stakeholder, what are their key objectives, giving them as much coaching as necessary in advance so that they are successful, in those interactions on those projects, rather than after the fact, is really helpful for their own development and for their own perception within the organization more broadly. And lastly on this, I think it's very important to champion your team, to understand everyone's got strengths and weaknesses. Generally, as you're at a more senior level, the people within your team, there's a reason you're more senior. They haven't developed, they haven't had as much experience as you have perhaps, but focusing on what they're doing well and then helping them develop is really critical. And being champions of your team is critical because, as we all know, insurance is a very complicated industry. There's a lot of complexity. If you're stretching yourself, if everything always goes perfect, you're probably not stretching yourself or ambitious enough as an organization. But focusing on, as issues come up, being a champion for your team and focusing on how to go forward and how to help your team members thrive and develop is really critical. So those are my 3 lessons of things I learned that I found worked well. Next, in terms of a lesson that did not work as well for me, or is what I learned not to do over time, was skipping stakeholder alignment, what I would call. And it's very difficult here very easy to skip this step of, well, I've got 7 stakeholders on board, or I've got 2 stakeholders on board. This is the right answer. Let's just go and do it. And what I've found is that even if you can get senior level agreement to do something, if the stakeholders are not truly bought in and agree with the approach, it will not be as successful, right? They won't explicitly resist, but you can't be successful with doing something hard if you have compliance level energy where people are only doing exactly what you tell them to do. You want people to be bought in and engaged. And if you skip stakeholder alignment and essentially go over someone's head, you might win the battle, but you'll lose the war ultimately, because you need to go through that step of getting their buy-in. And what I found when working with stakeholders is that gathering their feedback, understanding their objectives, and listening to their feedback, and then bringing a proposal back to them based upon that is generally, most people are very reasonable in my experience. So, virtually everyone is very reasonable. What people don't like is not being listened to, right? But people understand and appreciate that they have a point of view and there's 10 other points of view. And if your strategy incorporates everyone's point of view, it's not going to be exactly what any individual would do necessarily. But I find the stakeholders are much more open and willing to follow and buy into your strategy if you've taken the time to both listen to them, understand their feedback and considerations, and incorporate that into your overall strategy, which ultimately leads to a better strategy, leads to a better vision for the organization overall. But that's really critical. And certainly every time I've tried to rush that step, long term it hasn't worked out well for me. I've always found it's really, really critical to get the stakeholder alignment, and figure out ways to get folks to buy in. And the key to that is understanding their objectives. And, it's not just about the right answer. You have to convince the stakeholders to buy in, which is very achievable, but it's very, very tempting to skip that step because it does take additional time. So that was kind of my overview for leading large teams in terms of the things and the tips that have worked well for me. The next topic I wanted to cover was communicating with senior management. So I think with that, I think we have a question. I don't know, Alex, if you're going to pop up the question here on communicating with senior management.
Let me get that one up, Paul. This is the right question, right, Paul?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. So this the poll is on. Please respond, and as these answers are coming in, we'll monitor and then publish. Okay, we've got about half of the participants. We'll keep this open for about 10 more seconds. Okay. And here are the results for you, Paul.
Excellent. So it's good. Pitfalls to avoid. I'm very good at finding pitfalls, so I'll be able to share some pitfalls to avoid as relates to communicating with senior management and the board, and also buy-in and presentations to handle objections. And certainly it makes sense to what to say. I do feel like actuaries generally are quite good at figuring out what the right answer is. And then certainly I've found in my career that more and more of my time is spent on how to get everyone to agree to do that right answer, which is really critical, because if you don't have both components, both the right answer and get people to agree, that's not worth anything ultimately. So I think that's good there. So in terms of I kind of think about kind of the key things as it relates to communicating with senior management and the board is, one, figuring out what to say, which I think people have, sounds like high confidence in that. And then I believe there's a critical phase before you go into that meeting or before you seek that final approval. The process before you say it, the process before the meeting is really critical if you're going to be successful with senior management and the board. And then the third one is how to say it. Like how do you present most effectively in those meetings with the board or with senior management? And then after that, I'll cover some pitfalls. After that, of things that I've learned along the way of pitfalls to avoid. So in terms of what to say, I think this is pretty brief, but I would say a critical thing is keep it brief and concise. You can always put a lot of stuff in the appendix, if so, but I'm a big believer in keeping it concise. It's also really critical to understand your audience and how they like to receive information. And even if they don't tell you, it's incumbent upon you to find that out, right? Whether it's asking them directly, whether it's asking your peers or your manager or other people that have presented to those stakeholders, understanding what works most effectively with them is really critical so that you can frame in a language that they most understand. The way I think about most things is, there's either a problem or an opportunity. So, here's the problem or opportunity, and here's how we're going to solve it. Here's our proposed solution, and here's the benefits and why this is the best solution. I think those are really the critical things. And I think especially for senior management and the board, what they really want to know is the solution and if things are on track. So I would focus on that, and I think the other element is to not be prepared for that next level of questions. So the way I think about it is, and the way I've learned from CEOs and others that have kind of coached me on this is, you want to have you want to be prepared for one level of questions down from the presentation materials. And then, two levels down from the presentation materials, usually in a senior management meeting, it's unlikely people will go that deep because that would be derailing the meeting for their peers, which they wouldn't generally do. And two, it's completely reasonable to take that away as a follow-up if it's something that deep. But one level down of questions, the expectation is that you'll be able to answer that first level of questions well. The last thing I would say on this, which is the term I learned very early in my career, I think actually probably within the first couple of months, was, and this is a pitfall, is don't be a Boeing, is the term that the CFO of my first role taught me and others. And that meant bearer of inconsistent numbers. And what that meant was, especially as an actuary, you don't ever want to have a presentation where the numbers are inconsistent. So the tables don't add up, or there's a math error somewhere in the table, or the explanation. One, so what's kind of within the presentation itself needs to all be internally consistent. And then two, consistency with what you're presenting currently to prior presentations. Because when you're talking about senior management or a board, typically the first thing they'll do is they'll go back and look at, what was the last time you presented to them, and they'll go back and review that. And if there's an inconsistency, that has a very detrimental impact on your credibility as a presenter. So rightly or wrongly, at the senior management or board number, the actuaries are thought about as the number people, the people that understand the numbers, the people that understand the math. So if you ever present anything that someone that they would self-perceive as not the math person, if they can find your math error, you lose credibility completely. And then even if it's completely innocuous issue, that's also really important in my experience. So next would be before the meeting. So I'm a big believer, and this goes back to the stakeholder alignment discussion that we had on leading large teams. I'm a big believer in pre-wiring. And what that means is that before I go into a meeting, I want to get everyone, if there's anything controversial, I want to get everyone that would have a view. I want to review that presentation with them or review that issue with them and make sure they've bought in advance of that meeting. I would do that with everyone except for the most senior person in the meeting. The way I think about the meeting itself is you're presenting to the most senior person in the meeting, whether it's the CEO, or the CFO or the chairman of the board. Your audience is the most senior person in the room. And because at the higher level, you are very constrained in terms of how much time you have to present, very constrained. It could be 10 minutes, 20 minutes for something a team of 10 people spent, quarters on. The worst thing that can happen is if one of the stakeholders or one of the senior folks disagrees with an issue, that won't get resolved in the meeting, and you don't really want it to get resolved. You don't want the more senior person to squash one of your stakeholders' points of view, because that'll make them a detractor versus a supporter longer term. So if there's a question, and a question could just be an understanding question, not really pushing or advocating for something different, but it's important to have those discussions with stakeholders that will be in the room in advance so that they can get fully up to speed and understand the issue, share any feedback, and really make them educated on the topic so that they're not asking questions that could undermine approval in the meeting. Because ultimately, in the meeting, if those questions come up, the end result is you just have to have another meeting, right? So that generally either results in two bad outcomes. One bad outcome is your stakeholders' point of view gets squashed because there's not enough time to resolve it, and they're unhappy. Or two, the most common outcome would be that you then now need to have a new meeting a month later, right? So that just delays projects, it delays approvals, it delays things moving on. So while it takes more of your time to do the pre-wiring in advance and talk with and I do the pre-wiring one-on-one. So if I have a meeting with, the CEO and 5 key reports of the CEO, for example, I would meet with, each of those individuals individually and make sure that they buy into it. And I think about it as I'm the one trying to get something approved. I'm trying to advocate for someone. When I'm in the big meeting, the stakeholder is, having to wait in line with everyone else effectively, and their time is being taken up by listening to their other stakeholders' questions, which may be completely irrelevant to what they care about. Versus if I go have a one-on-one discussion with that stakeholder, their time is being optimized because they're able to focus in on the things they care about. And they're also able to be a lot more candid, kind of about their point of view, because they're not worried about what the CEO thinks or other stakeholders think. So while it may feel like instead of a half hour, I'm spending 3 or 4 hours, that's way better than having to go prepare a new deck and have a bunch of follow-ups and have another meeting a month later. That until I do that pre-wiring, I'm not going to get approval. So that's a really critical step. And the onus is on me as the person seeking something to go, get all of my stakeholders' agreement. And then ultimately, what the CEO or the board wants to see when you're in that meeting is really they just want confirmation that all of the stakeholders are bought in. Because from their perspective, okay, if operations is fine and IT is fine and sales is fine and finance is fine, that's what they care about ultimately, is that there's no issues across. If everyone else buys in, it's very difficult for a CEO to say, no, I disagree with, all 6, most senior members of my team on something. So that I believe is really important. And ultimately it leads to more efficiency longer term. And it's kind of a reality of life. In terms of then, I would go next to how to say it. And the key thing in my mind that I've learned over time and focused on is it's what your stakeholders understand. It's not what you say. And what that means is, if you're, speaking very basic actuarial language and, your CEO came from a sales background or operations background or some other background, it's up to you to translate into language that they understand. It's not up to them, right? So and if they don't understand, most people won't be self-reflective and think that it's on them. They'll fundamentally, consciously or unconsciously blame you for not communicating it well to them. And ultimately, they have, for whatever a number of issues you have at a senior level, that senior stakeholder has 10 times or 100 times as many issues they're worrying about. So they don't have the time and energy. While they will have the capability if they wanted to. People at a senior level are smart enough to go learn everything you're working on. They're smart enough, but they don't have the time. And part of your role as a senior leader is to be able to help them understand the issues in a way that's efficient for them so that they can handle your issues and everyone else's issues. So it's up to you to communicate in a way that they understand. And the same thing applies as you're talking with your various stakeholders, whether it's sales or operations or legal or accounting. You want to understand their language and how they think about things so that you can communicate to them in a way that they understand. And if you think about it, everyone has their own professional, jargon, I guess you could call it, or language. And it's important that if you can understand 10%, you're way ahead of everyone else, and you're much better able to communicate with them. So how you say what language you use is very important. The other thing to keep in mind is that as you move up in your career, the level of subject matter, the level of subject matter expertise on your topic goes up and up and up, but then goes down, right? So if you're entry level, your boss knows way more about what you're working on than you do. When you're leading a team of individual contributors, your boss still generally knows a lot more about your issues than you do. And then when you go up, maybe to the chief actuary, maybe the chief actuary knows more, maybe not, it depends. But definitely when you get to outside of your profession, your stakeholders don't know as much as you do about your content matter in general. So you have to keep that in mind. And it's not because, and that they always are very smart, they're always very successful, they're always very capable, but because they're spread so thin and there's only so much time in the day, that level of knowledge after a certain point hits an inflection point and then goes down. So it's important that you speak in a way that they understand and are kind of empathetic to, focusing on making sure they have that understanding, and owning that responsibility. The next thing I would say on this would be to have conviction, right? So you never want to go. You always want to go into a meeting confident in what you're presenting. So you want to be open-minded and understand new information that comes in, but you also want to have a reasonably high level of conviction. So I've seen, for example, a lot of some senior stakeholders in my experience will basically always challenge everything. And the purpose of that is actually just to understand how much you believe it, right? So it's not because they don't want you to do it. It's because they want to see how much you believe in it, and if you have enough confidence in what you're presenting, and to test your assumptions. So it's important that you don't, at the first question, just cave essentially, or just think that, it's important that you can defend your proposal, defend your assumptions, defend what you're doing very well. It's important to have the right level of reading the room to understand, okay, there's a certain level of strong enough objections where it makes sense to essentially take those away, think about them, come back. It's new information, it's new data. So it's important. So there's a certain level of objections that makes sense to respond to in a certain way as a follow-up or a takeaway. There's a different set of questions where it's important to have a good level of confidence in terms of being able to address those questions and have confidence in what you're doing, and strike that balance. But most of the time, you want to be able to have confidence and go through, while not steamrolling people, but making sure that you can articulate why did you come to a sort of conclusion, and be able to articulate it in a way that shows you have high conviction in what you're proposing, especially for something that's more qualitative versus quantitative, which is usually where there's more questions or objections. Because when you get to the quantitative, people are less likely to object because you are the expert on the quantitative numbers. But when it comes to qualitative issues, how are you going to organize your team, what your priorities are going to be, how many resources you need, what you need for budget, those things are much more qualitative. And there it's important that, and so there everyone can have an opinion. And it's important to kind of have a well thought out and have conviction in what you're saying. The third thing on this is to focus on the most senior person. So understand the body language of that most senior person, the person ultimately approving. If they're looking down, if they're looking at their phone, if they're looking at a laptop, it's time to move on to the next slide. So you don't want to, drain your slides. The point of the presentation is to get to the objective. So if the objective is to get something approved, then you want to move along in the presentation expeditiously and get to the, focus on getting the thing approved. You don't want to waste the senior most person's time. So if they're not going to tell you that you're wasting their time, but they'll give you nonverbal cues that it's time to move on and continue, because they have 1,000 other things they're worried about, and they would much prefer, if they can approve something in 10 minutes rather than 30 minutes, they would rather do it in 10 minutes. So understanding their nonverbal cues of when to move on, when to go deeper, when to continue, understanding that is really critical. And with that, it's okay if people if questions drive you deeper, that's okay, but you don't want to go too deep by yourself. You want to allow other people to drive you deeper where they want to go deeper, where they have more questions, which oftentimes could be 10% or 20% of your presentation. When people are focused on 10 or 20% of the presentation, you want to focus on that. You want to focus on that area, because they're fine with the other 80%. So it's not, while it's all great work that went in to the other 80%, if they're already sold on that, then just focus on the 10 or 20%. And then that gets to my last suggestion is once you've sold your audience, once they agree, then you can finish the presentation. It's not about going through every metric, going through every graph, going through everything. If the audience, whether it's a CEO, whether it's the board, if they agree, then you want to end the presentation and wrap up. And the way to think about it is once you want to stop selling once people are sold. Because then if you keep talking, then you might unsell them. They might think of something new that they have concerns about or additional questions. So you want to go, so you want to stop once they're sold. So then in terms of pitfalls, so one pitfall that that actually took me a long time to fully, I don't know if I'm, probably never 100% fully remediated, but I think every role I get better at this, I guess I would say, is you don't want to escalate conflict. You want to resolve it. And this can be very, very difficult to resist, right? Because you'll oftentimes have very high conviction that you're right and someone else is wrong, and you can convince that someone more senior that you're right and they're wrong, and that's going to resolve it. In my experience, that has never been a good idea. And I've tried that many times, and it's never, sometimes it's never hurt me too bad, but it's never worth it in my experience, because you win the battle, but you lose the war at best. But what typically happens if you escalate a conflict, if I think X and someone else thinks Y, and I'm right because of A, B, and C, if your boss or your boss's boss, whoever agrees with you, well, they're just going to go ask the other person, and the other person is going to say, well, I'm right because of C, D, E, and F, and the most senior person will not have time to spend any more time on it, and they'll go tell the two of you to go figure it out, and they'll think less of both of you because you can't resolve it amongst yourselves, and that's driving down the productivity of the overall organization underneath that more senior leader. Well, rightly or wrongly, the way I think about it is you want to assume that everyone has positive intent. They're all trying to do the right thing for the company. They're all trying to do the right thing for the customer. They're all trying to grow the business. So you want to assume that people have positive intent, but they also are coming from a different background. They have different objectives. They have different short-term pressures, different long-term pressures. They have a different educational background, a different professional background. They have different stakeholders they're concerned about. They have different bosses. Ultimately, it's up to you to resolve it and to figure out how to resolve it with your peers. In a perfect world, it would be up to them too. But ultimately, I take it incumbent upon myself that I need to figure out how to get my peers to buy in. And ultimately, if I can't, well, there's 5 other great things I can do that I can get my peers to buy in. I need to go do those other 5 things, because if I try to do the 6th thing, even if I have the right answer, if I can't get everyone to agree to do it, it won't be successful. Even if I can get, a temporary, yes, you can go do that, it won't be successful over the long term because there won't be that right level of buy-in. And so that's a big pitfall that took me a long time. And I think for, technical folks like actuaries in particular, I did the math, the answer C, that's the answer. Ultimately, that's only 20%. You have to get the buy-in to be able to do things. And what I found in my experience is that, there may be 10 things I want to do, and early in my career, I could get 3 of them done. And then the other 7 I can't. But then you get to a more senior level, and then you can do, 4 more of them. And you also figure out that, well, the other 3 actually were a bad idea and I should have done them anyways. But it's important here to not escalate conflict and just to work through it and resolve it. And not use, senior management meetings, not use board meetings, not use other meetings as a way to resolve it. You want to resolve it with folks separately. In terms of other pitfalls, as it relates to communicating with senior management or with the board. I guess, one pitfall is that I didn't talk about yet is that you want to make sure to give your audience enough time to review the materials and get comfortable with them. So that includes the pre-wiring discussion, but it also includes oftentimes the board or the CEO, they'll want 24 hours or 48 hours or a week or some timeline. Ultimately, you're much better off making sure that they have that amount of time. And then if sometimes you do that, you send it to them a week in advance and they don't read it, well, that's on them, right? But and they feel that themselves and they're sort of empathetic to, oh, I didn't read, they sort of understand it's on them. If you followed their guideline and they didn't, read the materials or prepare, they sort of feel that guilt themselves and are actually tend to be more empathetic and accommodating within the meetings. But if you send it to them 4 days in advance and they ask for 5, even if they were never going to read it, it's your fault, right? They're going to blame you and be upset that you didn't give them enough time to read it, even if half the time they would have been too busy. So I think one pitfall is to make sure to accommodate the timelines. And ultimately, if you can't give your stakeholders enough time, it's better to reschedule the meeting if possible or cancel the meeting and give them enough time to read the materials before you have the presentation, because you want them to feel as well prepared as possible. I think that the third pitfall, I think the third pitfall would just be I always think about when I go into a meeting or I'm going into a discussion with senior management or the board, I only want to have that if it's going to be successful. So it's better to cancel, it's better to defer, it's better to buy more time. The important thing is that it's successful every time, and that's why it goes back to the pre-wiring. It goes back to it's better to take a little more time and do it really well than to rush it and do it poorly, because there's a lot more empathy for taking a little more time and making sure it's right than do it poorly and because then that wastes. Ultimately, senior folks, they have lots on their plate. If you give them an extra week or a couple days, they won't think much of that because it didn't actually take any of their time. But if you go in a meeting and waste an hour of their time, they aren't happy about that. So in terms of questions, so maybe before I go there, so in terms of questions, let's see here. So oh, yes, that was a great question from Felice on would you agree that some of these suggestions might be hard to implement in a virtual world? Any specific insights for virtual meetings? So I would say that I think it's very important in terms of how you communicate to communicate in the most effective way possible. And the most effective way is in person. The next most important way is on video. Next after that is a phone call, and after that is email. So my philosophy is I only email if it's non-controversial. So email is only for agreement or for something positive. Never email anything negative or controversial. That never works in my experience. And then sets you up for an email to get forwarded 10 times and doesn't actually resolve the issue. If you have something controversial, negative, call the person up, pick up the phone, or better do a video call with them, or even better, go walk over to their desk and talk to them. My rule of thumb would be if you're presenting to someone, your boss or more senior and you're local, you should always do it in person and always go in and always find a day when they're in the office and always go do it in person. If it's 2 levels up, I would fly there and do the presentation as much as possible, as much as your budget allows for, et cetera, because people 2 levels up and above, those really determine your career success ultimately. And being in the room is much more effective than being virtual. If it's non-controversial, then it's fine, right? So if it's here's our quarterly results, and nothing's unusual, everything's good news, that you can do virtual and it's not a big deal. But if it's a quarter where, oh, this thing is bad or this thing's bad, you want to be in person as much as possible, because yes, that takes more time. You have to commute or you have to fly somewhere, but ultimately getting people to yes and getting people to agree is really hard, right? So and that extra bit of effectiveness from being in person is valuable, especially if anything's at all controversial. So I would invest in that. So that's kind of the first suggestion. In terms of so the number one suggestion is, if it's senior management and the board, do whatever you can to be in person. Would be my suggestion. I would rather not attend the meeting than try to present virtually to a senior management of the board, is my philosophy overall. In terms of virtual meetings, the thing to keep in mind with virtual meetings, which is very difficult, is that people can be distracted very easily, right? So people can, be looking at, some website, maybe maybe someone's reading the Wall Street Journal right now, for example. People can be looking at different things and be very easily distracted. So it's that much more critical to be concise and to be really focused on what folks want. In virtual meetings, something that I like to do is call on people and ask them more explicitly, because that makes sure, one, that makes people be more engaged, and kind of keeps their attention much more. So I would focus on making it interactive. The other thing in virtual meetings that I like to do is, and I'm big in general, which I don't think I didn't cover that in my facilitative leadership, but I always like with my team, for example, to listen first and speak last. So hear people out. And I think that's even more critical in a virtual meeting, that you hear people first, and then go from there. Yeah, I think those would be for virtual meetings. In terms of resources or training to write concise executive summaries. So one of the books I mentioned here is the Minto. I think it's the Pyramid. Yeah, would be the Pyramid Principle. Is a good one for articulating kind of executive summaries and just articulating communications generally. I usually think about the rule of three. So I think this is a classic, like, consultant, big, McKinsey, BCG with Boston Consulting, et cetera, kind of framing. But I like it, but it helps in my mind, it helps to make you think more logically. So I think I like to think about the rule of three of, boil it down to 3 points. And then within those 3 points, I can have 3 subpoints. But I think about it, trying to get the executive summary down to 3 major points with maybe a couple of subpoints is important. The other thing for executive summaries, the way I would think about, I guess, executive summaries is, someone should be able to read that and understand your proposal. And if they trust you at a high level, that should be all they need. So if they trust you, they learn what they need to learn from that proposal, and they're good to go based on the executive summary. And then, to the extent they have questions, they can then go to the next slides and understand, okay, I don't understand this point, let me dive in deeper on that point. But at a senior level, they want to only need to go through what they have to go through. So if they trust your executive summary, it's sufficiently succinct. It clearly states, my objective's this is the problem, this is what I propose to do about it, and this is why we should do it. And they trust you enough, then that should be enough for most people. But if it's a controversial issue for them, or they have a strong view, they may want to dive in, in the subsequent slides. But that would be the focus. And then on the subsequent slides, I like to think about it as, what's the headline overall? So if someone is going to just read the headline, what's that one sentence that summarizes the slide? And then the slide should add additional data, whether it's a chart or a table or some bullet points. What is the additional data that someone would need if they don't trust that headline or they want to learn more? And then ultimately, your executive summary effectively becomes a aggregation of those headlines, oftentimes. Okay, so then in terms of the last question, I think, Alex, did you want to pull up the last question?
Sure thing. Let me pull that up here, Paul.
Sure.
Okay, this poll is now out. I'm going to keep it open for about 45 seconds. We've got about half of the answers so far, closing out in a few seconds here.
All right, it looks like the stakeholder management, stakeholder management, pre-wiring, that's good. Yeah, I think that's very important. So I'm glad to hear that that was helpful for folks. Focusing on what people hear, I think is very important because I think what actuaries do is very complex. And in my role and in a lot of similar roles, I spend all day, for the most part, talking to non-actuaries and helping them understand what we do. And throughout my career as I moved up in organizations, I always underestimate the challenges of the next level up. And that's one that's really important is helping your stakeholders understand, resolving conflicts good. And the pre-wiring, that's good. I personally think that starting with trust is extremely important, but but maybe everything else was more helpful overall. So in terms of these are some additional readings I would suggest on each of these topics. So if you're interested in each of these topics, this is my favorite book on the topic. Whether it's the first 90 days, going to a new role, effective manager for leading teams, winning by Jack Welch in terms of developing teams, getting to yes. So getting to yes is a negotiation book, but I think that's a large part of how you get stakeholder alignment. Is it's a negotiation, right? And I think the getting to yes is the best win-win negotiation book that I've read so far. On the executive summaries, the pyramid principle, pre-wiring, the finer points of leadership, what they understand presenting to win is a good one on developing presentation, then communicating it, and then not escalating conflict is a good book, Executive Warfare, I think by actually a former insurance executive. Any additional questions?
If you have any questions, please submit in the chat or the Q&A box. Paul, so far, no questions. We can wait a few seconds or so, though.
All right, so I guess maybe if there's no more question, I think the last thing I would leave you with is to really focus on both leading large teams and communicating with everyone, but senior management and the board especially, as a skill to develop, right? So I think about all the math classes I took, all the actual exams I took, they're all really valuable, but ultimately it's about having a business impact and adding value to a company. And those other skills can be learned and are important to invest in and kind of try to learn those skills and develop them. So I would just encourage that as what I would leave you with is a very learnable skills and also very important to take the time and energy and own for yourself your own professional development of learning those skills. All right, thanks everyone, appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your time, for your insights. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be at the same Zoom link tomorrow, 11 a.m. Central. See you all there.